Welcome to the debate. We are focusing today on Surah Al-Fatihah, the opening. It's the fundamental text that really anchors the source material. It is brief, yes, but it's universally central to daily Muslim life and practice.
And its 7 verses establish, well, everything. You have theology, relationship, purpose. But because it serves so many masters as a declaration, as a prayer, and a contract, its primary function becomes, I think, a point of necessary inquiry.
Absolutely. And that's the tension we really have to address. Identifying the ultimate functional core of this surah. Does its primary value reside in the, let's call it the definitive declaration of divine sovereignty and attributes? You know, the foundation laid in that first half?
Or is its core strength found in the practical petition for existential guidance? The establishment of the covenant of worship? I would maintain that while the declarations are, of course, the essential backdrop, the surah's core utility, the reason it's there 5 times a day, is that establishment of the living covenant of worship and the petition for guidance that has to inform our actions.
And I'll be asserting that the primary function is that authoritative, theological declaration of Allah's attributes and absolute rule. This comprehensive, almost non-negotiable framework has to be established first. Any petition is merely a necessary consequence of that foundation. That's where the ultimate value lies.
Well, let's examine the weight of those opening verses then.
My core position is that the true power, the true value of the surah resides in the definitive declarations made in the first 4 verses. The text begins by establishing the divine identity and authority in the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful, followed by the all-encompassing statement, all praise is for Allah, Lord of all worlds. This declaration of universal sovereignty and absolute praise, Alhamd, is a statement of objective reality. It isn't contingent on whether we feel thankful or, whether we're in need.
But doesn't the context immediately render that objective statement relevant to the petitioner?
It is relevant as a foundation, not as a primary function. The identification of Allah as the master of the day of judgment in verse 4 sets the necessary theological stage that simply demands submission. This declaration of absolute authority over our ultimate accountability, it's the immutable truth upon which all subsequent relationship has to rest. The declaration defines the divine's nature. The request is merely the human reaction to that nature.
I see. I come at it from a different angle. That declaration is essential, I grant you that, but I believe it serves the end goal of relationship. The surah's ultimate function is dynamic and relational. It's centered on that existential contract and the urgent request for guidance found in verses 5 through 7. If we're going to discuss the utility of the surah in daily life 5 times a day, every single day, we have to focus on the dynamic interaction.
That sounds like you're prioritizing sort of spiritual comfort and a practical mechanism over absolute theological truth.
No, I prioritize the text's stated purpose for humanity. The entire surah pivots both structurally and rhetorically on the direct address in verse 5. You alone we worship, and you alone we ask for help. This immediate transition, it establishes the practical covenant and human reliance. The structure is so carefully engineered to lead into the crucial petition that follows. Guide us to the straight path. This isn't just a list of attributes, it's a commitment preceding a request for ongoing, vital direction.
But you cannot seek direction until you've established the identity and the jurisdiction of the guide. If we strip away the sovereign declaration of the first 4 verses, what prevents the petition from becoming just a self-help mantra?
Is paramount for the utility of the surah. It defines the path of those you have blessed, and just as importantly, distinguishes them from those you are displeased with or those who are astray. If its primary use is to inform and guide behavior, then the continuous petition for existential navigation is its core function, not just the definition of the sovereign who sets the course.
Let's delve deeper into that. The function of the divine attributes in the opening verses, specifically the repetition of the most compassionate, the most merciful. You see this as a qualification for the petitioner. I see it as an intrinsic definition of the divine.
That framing misses the immense weight of the transition. The repetition serves as essential contextual assurance for the petitioner. And why? Because the very next attribute mentioned is the terrifying authority of the master of the day of judgment.
The human capacity to then declare reliance and worship in verse 5 is rooted entirely in the preceding assurance that this absolute master is overwhelmingly characterized by Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim.
I see the structural argument, but that's a functional reading that I think dilutes the ontological weight. I would argue this repetition serves not merely as a precursor to petition, but as an intrinsic, non-negotiable definition of the divine. The praise, al-hamd, is an end in itself, a reflection of inherent perfection, completely independent of human need. The attributes are stated as absolute, static facts about the Lord of all worlds. They are true whether or not a human being is even present to make a request.
But this surah isn't meant to be a static theological thesis. It's the core of our daily ritual prayer. Its function is kinetic, it's active. If the attributes were merely declarations of power, without that functional emphasis on mercy, the plea for guidance would be based purely on fear and obligation, not the hopeful reliance that characterizes genuine spiritual submission. The mercy attributes are the functional viability of the petition.
Hope and fear are two sides of the same coin when you stand before the Master of the Day of Judgment. The declaration of absolute lordship and judgment, it creates the necessity for the petitioner to recognize the divine's encompassing mercy. Otherwise, the petition itself would be an act of futility or despair. The declaration defines the requirement. The petition fulfills it. The declaration has to hold the primary weight.
But the text is constructed to prompt action. If the declaration were the core, the surah could just end at verse 4. It doesn't. It structurally leads directly into the covenant of action and reliance. And that brings us to the structural and thematic core, the pivot in verse 5. Ayyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. You alone we worship, and you alone we ask for help. This verse is the structural and thematic core because it instantly converts static theology into a living, practical relationship. It is the human commitment, we worship, coupled immediately with the recognition of need, we ask for help. This sequence defines the practical utility of the surah in daily life. Without this pivotal transition, the surah remains an abstract creed. Its genius and its primary value for the daily practitioner lies in this immediate translation of truth into lived practice.
I resist the idea that the response defines the core. The commitment, you alone we worship, isn't an arbitrary choice. It is an obligatory response to the declaration of absolute lordship in verse 2 and ultimate judgment in verse 4. The declaration imposes the requirement for worship and defines the only legitimate source of help. So the declaration drives the petition is the required response, making it secondary in value.
Yet the declaration of worship is immediately coupled with a practical request for help, Iyyaka nasta'in. Why? Because the commitment to worship is meaningless without the continuous need for divine aid in fulfilling that very commitment. The value is found in the synthesis of commitment and continuous dependence. This sequence is what defines the relationship in real time, not just in abstract theology. When we recite this daily, we are actively reestablishing this covenant, making the covenant itself the most dynamic and therefore functionally primary part of the surah.
I would argue the daily repetition reinforces the foundation that must be reestablished. Every time we begin the prayer, we start with the absolute truth of sovereignty and praise, before daring to submit our covenant. We are commanded to recognize the Master before we commit to the service. The ontological status of the divine must precede and therefore outweigh the human commitment.
The ontological status of the divine is fixed. The human commitment is variable and requires constant renewal. The surah's structural core, therefore, must lie in the verses that deal with the variable human element, the worship and the guidance. If the foundational declaration were the core, it would be treated as an immutable statement. Instead, it is immediately translated into a dynamic, bilateral contract.
But that contract derives all its force from the identity of the judge who is holding us accountable, which brings us to the crucial final point, the definition of the straight path. The focus on the path of those you have blessed, is secondary to the overwhelming identity of the guide and judge. The path itself is simply what the sovereign master dictates. The true substantive weight in this part of the text is the profound theological distinction between those who receive favor and those who incur wrath, those you are displeased with, or who miss the mark, those who are astray. This distinction reinforces the ultimate authority of the judge, the Malik ad-Din. The path is defined by divine favor and displeasure, not by its inherent navigational complexity.
That's a compelling argument regarding the theological definition, but I think it underestimates the immense practical implication of defining the path by its outcome. If the primary function were merely theological declaration, a simple, generalized petition for guidance would suffice. But the surah goes further, explicitly forcing the petitioner to consider real-world ethical and historical outcomes. The blessed, the displeased, and the straying. This explicit detail shifts the focus decisively to practical ethics and real-world navigation. The daily utility of the surah is rooted in the constant, existential fear of falling into one of those two undesirable categories. The constant petition, guide us, is a functional necessity, making the navigational plea the primary driver of the surah's use in daily life. This is where the theology of the first half gets translated into a usable ethical map.
The map is useless without the cartographer's authority. The fear you reference, the necessity to avoid displeasure, it derives its force entirely from the preceding declaration of ultimate judgment. The detailed categorization reinforces the scope of the judge's authority, confirming that judgment covers all possible human orientations, both ignorance, astray, and conscious disobedience, displeased. The declaration of sovereignty is the engine, the petition for the path is the steering wheel. The engine is more critical to the function than the steering.
Yet the petition is the kinetic energy of the surah. We are constantly seeking direction. Consider the ritual structure of salah, the prayer. The surah is recited standalone in every unit of prayer, precisely because it is the foundational request that must be made before proceeding with the rest of the devotion. It is the verbal commitment and the urgent asking that define the act of worship, making the petition functionally primary.
The very fact that it is the opening, the Al-Fatih, confirms its role as the foundation. The declaration must be made first to establish the proper context of submission before the request can even proceed. The declaration frames the entire relationship, making all subsequent requests an acknowledgement of that prior established truth.
And the structure ensures that the absolute declaration is immediately personalized and translated into a dynamic, urgent request for aid. The declaration defines who God is, the petition defines what the human must continuously do, ask for guidance. For the daily practitioner, the asking is the core utility.
So we arrive back at the interplay between immutable foundation and continuous action. To summarize my position, the profound theological weight of the text, the comprehensive assertion of the Lord of all worlds, the most merciful, the master of the day of judgment, provides the immutable foundation. Without this absolute, definitive declaration of sovereignty, the subsequent plea for guidance lacks its necessary anchor. It risks reducing the divine-human relationship to, well, mere transactionality. The declaration of absolute truth is the bedrock that gives all subsequent relationship and petition its weight and its significance.
And I maintain that the surah's profound strength is its dynamic utility. For daily life, the covenant of worship, the Iyyaka na'budu, and the continuous practical necessity of the request for the straight path remain the defining features. The explicit structure ensures that the ultimate declaration of truth translates immediately into actionable, continuous direction and ethical navigation. It is the roadmap provided by the sovereign that we must repeatedly activate.
It is clear that this surah performs two monumental tasks simultaneously, defining the divine and defining the trajectory of the human.
Indeed, they are perfectly intertwined. We differ on which component provides the ultimate functional core, yet this exchange illuminates the comprehensive brilliance of the text, showing how it simultaneously functions as an absolute declaration of ultimate truth and the foundational mechanism for continuous human ethical and spiritual navigation.
An incredible text that demands this level of scrutiny.
There remains so much to explore in how perfectly these two critical functions converge in such concise language. Thank you for the thoughtful debate.